Hello and welcome back to my channel. This is Debbie. I realize now that I don't usually introduce myself, so hello, nice to meet you. Thanks for joining me here, and feel free to introduce yourself in the comments. How about this? You say who you are and what your favorite medium is to make art with, and then we can all get to know each other a little bit. I'd love that. So today I decided to set up a new gouache palette. I had initially intended to just use a smaller little palette that only had 12 wells, as my previous palette, the one that you'll see in this video, had gone moldy. Now, that is just because I keep a wet palette, so there's a bit more care involved with that, and also it has a lifespan, and that was paint that I had from years actually, and so that's just a natural thing that is bound to happen. Now, I learned gouache using a wet palette. It's not something I would necessarily recommend to everyone, especially if you're just starting out. It's a little bit harder to keep, but I personally do enjoy having the paint in a ready-to-use fashion. That means for gouache that it already has the water mixed in. And for me in particular, I like to add a little bit of white because I like it to be opaque. So, getting a little ahead of myself, but that's just to give you an outline of what's going on here. So I had colors in there in my palette that were moldy, and I cleaned that out. But I did have a few that were just dried out. And what I did is chip them out, and I rehydrated them, which is something in retrospect I wish I hadn't done. I hadn't have done. I thought that if I soaked the dried gouache chunks that I could get them somehow soft again, and this caused all kinds of problems, which I'll get into later. Anyhow, don't do what I do. If you have a palette that's dried out, you can always use it dry, and very many artists use their gouache palette in the same way that they would use a watercolor pan palette, and they just have dry gouache that they rehydrate every time that they're going to paint. So, my initial intention was to set up a whole new palette with new colors and, make a brand new starting point. But as I looked at the colors that I had in my pen, in my wells already, in that plastic palette, I realized that I really liked them the way they were. And for the most part, I just replicated the palette that I already had. A few colors I changed slightly, and a few colors I'm not sure if I'm going to keep, in particular the ones that I tried to rehydrate. This is an ongoing experiment that hasn't ended yet. So for the most part, I used the colors that I had, and I mean pure, straight out of the tube or the jars of gouache, and I would just put paint into the well, add a little bit of water, and sometimes a little bit of white. Now this is the way that I learned how to do gouache, and I like it because it makes sure that your color is opaque and that when you layer, you don't have to worry about not getting that opacity. That's just a preference, and it all depends on the way that you use it. But if you are going to add a little bit of white, I would just be careful and move slowly and add just a teeny bit at a time, because you can really shift the color and then you might accidentally create a pink where you once had a red. So just be careful with that. I was rummaging in the basement looking for some empty pots because I'm starting to sprout my garden, and I came across a bag of little gouache tubes that I had purchased while I was living in Germany. Now these are the really inexpensive ones that come in a set, and I was happy to find a few colors in there that I don't have and were actually very nice. So the Prussian blue, the yellow ochre, which came in very handy. Now I am also creating this palette with my watercolor palette in mind, because I want to be able to use these two things together, and I want to kind of have similar colors to the ones that I like to use. So that's kind of the reason for the color choices that I have made. So for me, a sepia is a crucial thing, and I made that using burnt umber and some black. I also always like to use kind of a blue-green, and I mixed a tone like that. And I decided that it would also be handy to have sort of like an olive green. And that was like the most complicated color mix, I guess, in this palette, which was yellow ochre, lemon yellow, burnt umber, and a little bit of that phthalo green. So in order to test my colors, I pulled out this Strathmore sketchbook. It's not really meant for water media necessarily, but I just wanted to have some toned paper to test the opacity, because if I tested it directly on a white piece of watercolor paper, it won't necessarily let me know if it's transparent. So this was like my way of making sure that the colors were nice and opaque. And I did that using this little template stencil and permanent marker. And that way, if it covered the black, it was like super, super opaque. So I did some swatches of the color here, and I would adjust accordingly, not only the opacity with the tiny increments of white, but also the consistency. If I felt it was too thick, I'd add a little bit of water just to make it the nice smooth consistency that I wanted. So the way I learned to use gouache is that it should be kind of like a milky, yogurty consistency. It's something that's really hard to explain, and you almost have to do it yourself. And when you're playing with your paint, you'll realize when it gets to that exact consistency that's like just nice and spreadable and allows for the gouache to lay flat, if that's the way you want to use it in kind of the classic designer method. a little clip of what happened to my Rehydrated Colors, and they didn't really completely rehydrate. Like, perhaps if I had left them longer, although I did leave them for a couple of days and it still didn't really happen. So what I thought was if I could just kind of mill it down again. So I pulled out a palette knife and I tried to mix the pigment in with the water, and this was very time consuming, and the outcome was less than satisfying. And I let these paints like sit in their wells for a few days, and they actually just started becoming spongy. So they kind of ballooned, and I guess, I don't know, I've never done this before and it was a bad idea. So what I've ended up doing is scooping those paints out, and I've let them dry out in a little ceramic dish, and I'll try to use them that way. And if I can't salvage them, then I might just end up tossing them, sadly, and either recreating those colors or adjusting them. Although I think I'll probably keep those colors because they're really just lighter versions of some of the other colors I have in there. So it's like a light yellow, a light blue, a light violet, and a light green. I just find it handy to have like that kind of highlight color ready to go. Just because of the way I tend to use things. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed a little look into how I put this palette together. In the next video, I will show you how I explore using it a little bit, and I hope you'll join me for that one. Thanks for coming around, guys. Bye.